little girl was freezing outside until the millionaire CEO whispered, "Want to have dinner with us?" Before we begin, we'd love to know, what country are you watching from? Leave it in the comments. And at the end, don't forget to give this story a rating from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. The night he found her, he had just stepped out of a black car, the kind that never touched dirt. When he saw her, 7 years old, curled up beside a restaurant wall, shivering so hard her teeth barely let her speak. She didn't ask for help, didn't cry, didn't even look at him at first. She was just trying to survive. And he was the kind of man who'd spent 20 years building walls so tall around his heart, no one could climb them. But he stopped. He knelt. And then, in the quietest voice he'd used in years, he asked, "Would you like to have dinner with us?" He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, but something in her eyes, something broken and brave, looked too much like the little girl he'd once held and lost. And in that one question, the world changed for both of them. The night he found her, the snow didn't fall like magic that night. It fell like grief, slow, heavy, and cruel. Downtown Chicago was blanketed in a silence only winter can bring. A silence that made even the richest man in the city feel small. David Mitchell pulled his collar higher as he stepped onto the sidewalk. A cashmere coat, a heated Mercedes, a billion-dollar empire. None of it kept out the cold he carried inside. Not tonight, not on the anniversary of the worst day of his life. He wasn't supposed to see her. She was just a shadow at first. A tiny figure, knees tucked to her chest, barely visible beside the wall of Santo's steakhouse. Her hair was a mess of wind and cold. Her lips were the kind of blue no child should ever be. She didn't beg, didn't look up. She was just there, alone, like someone left behind by the world. David stopped walking. He told himself to keep moving, that it wasn't his problem, that he didn't get involved. But then she looked up, and in those eyes, he saw it. That unbearable sadness, that quiet kind of bravery. Only kids who've known hunger, fear, and waiting understand. "Hey there, sweetheart." His voice came out softer than he expected. She flinched, but not from fear, from cold. "You must be freezing." "I'm okay, mister," she whispered, but her voice cracked under the lie. David crouched to her level. He couldn't stop his hands from shaking. And it wasn't the weather. "What's your name?" "Emma," she said. "Emma Carter." She tried to smile, but her teeth chattered. That name, that little voice, it tore something open in him that he thought was long dead. He looked around. The streets were empty. The restaurant was warm, just steps away. He could have walked past. He should have walked past. But some losses never leave you. Some regrets never sleep. He reached out a hand and said, almost pleading, "Emma, would you like to have dinner with us?" She stared at him for a moment, studying his eyes, not his coat, not his watch, just him. Then slowly, she nodded. And in that moment, David Mitchell had no idea that this little girl wasn't just someone he saved. She was about to save him, too. Chapter 1. The Girl in the Snow. He almost missed her. David Mitchell had just turned the corner, his thoughts lost in the usual winter haze of deadlines and regret, when something caught his eye. Something small, something trembling. A little girl. She was curled into herself beside the brick wall of a restaurant, her knees pulled up to her chest, thin arms wrapped tightly around them. Her jacket was the kind you'd find on a donation rack, too light, sleeves too short. Her lips had turned the kind of blue that made David's stomach twist. She wasn't crying, wasn't begging, just waiting for what? He didn't know, but he couldn't look away. His heart stuttered, like it always did, when memory crept in without warning. Alice, his daughter, would have been 22 this year, but she'd only lived to 6. brown hair, soft laugh, a love for books she could barely lift. This girl, this fragile little stranger, looked just like her. David stepped closer. The snow crunched under his Italian shoes as he slowly crouched down, careful not to frighten her. She didn't flinch. She barely even moved. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said softly, his voice unfamiliar even to himself. The girl looked up, her eyes God. Her eyes held too much for 7 years. A weight no child should have to carry. Sadness, hunger, and something else. Something worse. Resignation. "I'm okay, mister," she whispered. But David could hear the lie crack in her throat. She was freezing. Her voice shook with more than cold. "What's your name?" "Emma," she said. "Emma Carter?" She tried to smile, but it came out broken, like everything else about her. David swallowed the ache rising in his throat. "I'm David." He offered his hand, but didn't push it. "Emma, would you like to have dinner with me?" Her brow furrowed. "Mom says I shouldn't talk to strangers. She's a smart woman," he said gently. "And you're right to be careful, but it's warm inside. And they make the best hot chocolate in the whole city." She hesitated, looked past him, looked at his shoes, his coat, the restaurant door behind him, then back to his face, searching. After a long, quiet moment, she nodded. David helped her to her feet, and her hand, so small, in his, felt like a whisper from another life. She walked beside him, her steps cautious, her body trembling from the cold. He opened the door, and warm air wrapped around them like a blanket. Inside, light danced off crystal chandeliers. Waiters in pressed uniforms moved like clockwork, and everyone turned to stare at the child beside Chicago's most powerful CEO. David ignored them. Hot chocolate. He told the maître d' and make it fast. They sat in a leather booth by the window. Emma didn't speak. Her eyes were fixed on the linen napkins, the silver forks, the chandelier above her. "Have you ever been here before?" he asked. She shook her head. "It's pretty," he smiled. "You can relax, Emma. Nothing here is too fancy for you." When the hot chocolate arrived, whipped cream piled high, Emma's eyes went wide. "For me, all yours," David said. She took the first sip, and something shifted in her shoulders, loosening, cheeks coloring. For the first time, she looked like a child. He watched her, quietly, as she drank, and in that moment, he didn't feel like a CEO. He didn't feel powerful, or rich, or lost. He just felt human, and it was the first time he had in years. Chapter 2. A Mother's Shame. The restaurant door closed behind them with a hiss of warm air, but David barely noticed. Emma's cough had gotten worse. Each time, her small frame trembled. He felt it echo inside his chest. It wasn't just cold. Something deeper was gnawing at her fever. Illness. Exhaustion. "Emma," he said gently, "do you know where your mom is working tonight?" She nodded weakly. "The tall building with the green lights on top. She cleans the top floors at night." "Hartman Tower?" She said to wait for her. David didn't hesitate. 20 minutes later, they stood inside the marble lobby of Hartman Tower, a place David knew well. His company had offices on the 24th floor. The guards recognized him immediately. No questions asked. But it was Emma's hand in his that made him feel like he was breaking rules he hadn't known existed. They took the elevator in silence. Emma leaned against the wall, her breath shallow, her skin pale. David kept his hand around hers, like it was the only thing tethering her to this world. When the doors opened, they stepped into a hallway that smelled of bleach and cheap cleaner. Down the corridor, on her knees, scrubbing baseboards, was a woman with her blonde hair tied back in a fraying ponytail. Her movements were quick, tired, practiced, her hands red from chemicals, her uniform hanging loose from too much weight, lost too fast. David stopped. Emma pulled free from his hand and called out, "Mom." The woman looked up. First, she saw Emma, and her face lit with fierce, maternal relief. Then she saw David, and everything inside her turned to stone. She stood quickly, eyes wide, body tense, the rag still clutched in her hand like a shield. "What are you doing here?" she asked Emma, voice tight, almost scolding. "I told you to wait." She was freezing, David said quietly. She needed help. Sarah Carter turned to him like a storm. "Who are you?" "David Mitchell. I found your daughter outside Santos. She was sitting alone. She's very sick." Her eyes narrowed. She looked him over the suit, the coat, the calm, practiced authority. "You had no right to take my daughter anywhere." "I understand," he said, "but I couldn't leave her like that. She needs a doctor now." As if on cue, Emma coughed, violently, and this time it brought blood. Sarah's fury shattered into terror. "Oh God, Emma baby, no." She dropped to her knees beside her daughter. Emma tried to smile through the pain, reaching for her mother. "I'm okay, Mom. It's just a cough." Sarah pulled her close. No, it's not." David took a step forward, softening his voice. "Let me help. I can get her into Children's Memorial. Private care, no wait lists. I can't afford that." "You don't have to. I don't take charity," Sarah said, without looking up. "It's not charity. It's help from one parent to another." Finally, she looked at him. Her eyes were full of pride, shame, fear, and something else. Suspicion. "Why would someone like you help someone like us?" David hesitated. "Because 15 years ago, I had a daughter too." Silence settled between them like fresh snow. Heavy, still, unspoken. "Her name was Alice," he added quietly. "She didn't make it. But tonight, I saw your daughter, and I couldn't walk away." Sarah stared at him for a long time. Then she stood, still holding Emma in her arms. Her voice cracked as she said, "If we do this, it's a loan. I'll pay you back. Every penny." David nodded. "Whatever makes you comfortable." 40 minutes later, they were in the ER. Doctors rushed in. Machines beeped. David stayed in the waiting room, while Sarah disappeared behind a curtain of white coats and antiseptic light. He didn't pace, didn't check his phone. He just sat, and for the first time in 15 years, he prayed, not for miracles, not even for forgiveness, just for a little girl with brown hair and eyes too old for 7 to make it through the night. Chapter 3. I don't take charity. The clock on the wall read, "Tatuhu, deseta m," but David hadn't looked at it in over an hour. The waiting room was cold in a different way than the outside sterile, humming with the quiet fear that only hospitals know how to hold. He sat there, alone, elbows resting on his knees, hands folded like prayer. He hated hospitals. They always smelled like endings. The door finally creaked open. Sarah stepped into the hallway like she was carrying the weight of her entire life in her shoulders. Her cleaning uniform was still on, stained and faded under the fluorescent light. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, like she didn't want to take up any space, like survival had taught her to be small. "She's stable," she said, voice hoarse. "They said it's pneumonia, bad, but treatable." David exhaled so slowly, he didn't realize he'd been holding his breath. "She needs to stay for a week. Antibiotics, oxygen, monitors. They said we were lucky." Her voice broke. Then she caught herself, straightened. "I'll figure it out," she added quickly, eyes not meeting his. "We'll find a way." "Sarah," he said gently, "you don't have to." She turned toward him like a warning. "Don't." "I mean it." "Let me cover this. The hospital, everything. Just focus on her." I said no. The words weren't loud, but they were firm, final. He stood slowly. "I'm not trying to make you feel like you owe me, but I would," she snapped, finally meeting his eyes. Hers were wet, furious. You think I haven't spent the last year watching people look at me like I'm nothing, like I should be grateful for whatever scraps they toss my way. David didn't answer. She took a breath, steadied herself. I used to be someone. I worked at a diner 6 days a week, paid every bill on time, raised my daughter alone since the day she was born. I've never taken a handout, not once. You wouldn't be, David said quietly. You'd be giving me something back, too. She blinked. Like what? Peace, he said. I couldn't save my daughter, but I might be able to help yours. Silence. For a long time, neither of them moved. Then Sarah stepped back, folded her arms again like armor. If you want to help, she said slowly, give me a job. A real one. Not out of pity. Not because I'm some charity case you stumbled across in the snow. Give me something I can work for. Earn. David nodded. Done. Her eyes narrowed. You don't even know what I can do. I've seen enough, he said. You scrubbed baseboards like they mattered. That tells me everything I need to know. Sarah stared at him, like he was speaking a language she didn't quite believe in. Then quietly, warily, she nodded. One condition. Okay, I pay back every dollar you spend on Emma's care. Doesn't matter how long it takes. David opened his mouth to object, then stopped. This was who she was, not just a mother, not just a survivor. She was a woman who refused to be saved unless it was on her own terms. He nodded again. Deal. They sat in silence for a while, not as strangers, not yet as friends, but something softer. Sarah glanced at the nurse's desk. She's sleeping, she whispered. First time in days. She's looked peaceful. David smiled faintly. I brought some books. I thought maybe she'd like them. Books. Sarah looked at him. Puzzled, she told me at dinner. Her favorites, Charlotte's Web. She's read it 4 times. Sarah's eyes shimmered then, just for a second. A mother's heartbreak, laced with disbelief. Because someone remembered something so small, so ordinary, about her daughter. You listen to her, she murmured. People don't usually do that. I'm trying, he said. She didn't say thank you. Not yet, but she didn't look away either. And in that moment, beneath the fluorescent lights of a pediatric waiting room at 2:30 in the morning, something unspoken passed between them. Not charity, not guilt, not obligation. Something quieter, more dangerous. Trust. Chapter 4. I earned this. 3 days later, Sarah Carter walked into the lobby of Mitchell Technologies just before sunset. Her shoulders were square, her head held high, but inside, she was shaking. The glass doors closed behind her. With a hiss, polished marble floors stretched ahead, like something out of a dream she didn't dare have. The building was spotless, quiet, efficient, the kind of place that had never felt meant for someone like her. But today, it was hers, not as a guest, not as a story someone pitied. She was here to work. The job title sounded bigger than she expected. Facilities manager, night operations. Even the badge they'd handed her felt too official, too permanent. It came with an office small, tucked behind the service hallway, but clean. And the salary, enough to cover Emma's hospital bills in full over time. It came with health insurance, a place to live, a new beginning. But it wasn't the numbers that mattered. It was that she'd walked in and earned it. That's what she told herself as she changed into her uniform. This one knew. Her name stitched on the chest. She tied her blonde hair back into a neat ponytail, just like always. But for the first time in years, her hands didn't tremble while doing it. Meanwhile, 4 floors up, David sat in his office with a stack of reports untouched in front of him. He'd barely slept, not because of stress, because he kept thinking about that look on Sarah's face when she whispered, "People don't usually listen to her." He remembered Emma's quiet wonder in the restaurant, how she'd stared at the chandeliers, like they were stars she never thought she'd touch. He remembered her fingers, cold as ice, the blood on the napkin, her voice when she said, "I'm okay." Mister, he hadn't been able to help Alice, but maybe, just maybe, this was something close. He rose from his desk, pulled on his coat, and made his way to the lower levels. He didn't plan to stop by Sarah's office. He just did. She was bent over a clipboard, reviewing schedules with the maintenance supervisor. Her voice was calm, low, but firm. She didn't notice him at first, but when she did, something flickered across her face. Tension, then restraint. He didn't blame her. "Everything running okay?" he asked casually. She nodded. "So far, I had to reassign 2 of the cleaning staff. They were overlapping routes. Was wasting hours. Fixed it." David smiled. "Already making changes. Only the necessary ones." She replied. He nodded, started to turn away. But then her voice stopped him. "I meant what I said. About the hospital bills, I've asked accounting to set up automatic deductions from my paycheck." David turned back. "You don't have to." "I do," she interrupted. "Because this job, this apartment, this life, it has to be mine, or it's nothing. I won't be a favor you regret." He looked at her for a long time. "You're not," he said softly. "You're the first right decision I've made in a long time." Sarah looked away, pretending to focus on her clipboard. "Emma's doing better," she said after a pause. She drew a picture of the nurses today. "And you, me, you had a briefcase and a big smile," Sarah said, lips tugging at the corner. "It looked weird on you." He chuckled. "I'll work on that." That evening, just before 10, David took the elevator down again. The building was quiet. Most of the day staff had gone home. But through the glass windows of the small office near the service wing, he saw her, Emma, sitting cross-legged on a chair too big for her, a library book balanced on her knees. She wore a wool hat, pink with little ears. Her cheeks were flushed with health again. She looked up and waved. He stepped inside. "Hey, superstar." "Hi, Mr. David," she said brightly. "Guess what? I finished Charlotte's Web again. That's 5 times now. You're going to start correcting the author if you keep this up." She giggled. He pulled a book from behind his back. "I thought maybe you'd want to try something new." She gasped. "Matilda, I've heard of this one." He sat beside her, letting the quiet fill the room. Emma opened the book with reverence, flipping pages like they were something sacred. David watched her. Watched the way her lips moved while she read silently. Watched the way her eyes lit up when she reached a part she liked, and something inside him softened. Sarah stood in the doorway, unnoticed. She didn't interrupt. She just stood there, arms crossed, leaning against the frame, watching the man who'd once knelt in the snow beside her daughter, now sitting cross-legged beside her, offering stories and safety, like they were the same thing. She didn't trust him yet, not fully. But that night, in that quiet office, lit only by a reading lamp and a little girl's laughter, she started to hope. Chapter 5. The Man Who Left. The first sign that something was wrong came with the sound of raised voices in the lobby. David stepped off the elevator late that evening, coat slung over his arm, a book tucked beneath it for Emma. He'd been working late again, not because he needed to, but because, lately, home felt too quiet, too empty. Mitchell Technologies had begun to feel like more than just glass and steel. It felt lived in, alive, because of them. And then he heard it, a man's voice, loud, slurred, angry. "No one keeps me from my kid. You hear me? I got rights." David's pulse shifted. He followed the sound toward the marble atrium, where the night guard stood, awkwardly nearby, not sure whether to intervene. And then he saw them, Sarah, standing like a wall in front of her daughter, and Emma, clutching her mother's coat, eyes wide with fear. The man facing them was tall and thin, with wild eyes and a face too familiar to be unknown. Hair matted, jacket stained, breath sharp with the bitter stench of liquor. "Mark Carter," Sarah hissed, low and furious. "You don't belong here. I'm her father." He barked, "You can't keep her from me. She's mine too." "You left," she snapped. "You walked out when she was 2. You never called, never paid. You don't get to come back now." Smelling like whiskey and shouting in lobbies, David stepped forward, calm, controlled. "Is there a problem here?" The man's eyes flicked toward him, scanning his expensive coat, the quiet authority in his voice. "And who the hell are you?" "I'm David Mitchell," he said plainly. "I own this building." Mark's gaze narrowed. "Oh, so this is him, huh?" He turned to Sarah. "The sugar daddy. The one who bought you a job and bought you a roof and now thinks he owns you." "Enough," Sarah snapped, her voice shaking. "You're drunk. You're scaring her." Mark took a step forward. "Emma's my kid too." David moved fast, not violent, not loud, but his body slid in front of Emma without thought, his hand gently guiding Sarah and the child back. "Sir," he said, voice quiet but final, "you need to leave. Now." "I ain't going anywhere." David pulled out his phone, thumb already hovering over the screen. Sarah's hand gripped his coat. "Don't let me talk to him." David hesitated. Emma coughed behind them, small and scared. Sarah turned to her daughter. "Sweetheart, go upstairs. I'll be up soon." Emma shook her head violently. "No, I don't want to leave you." David knelt. "Emma, it's okay. I'll go with you. We'll wait by the front desk. Just give your mom a few minutes." She clung to him like he was a tree in a storm, but finally nodded. David led her away, one protective glance over his shoulder. Sarah turned back to the man who used to be her husband. "What do you want?" "Mark, I want what's mine. You gave up what was yours the second you left," she said. "Don't pretend this is about Emma." Mark's expression faltered. The rage behind his eyes didn't hide the desperation. "I'm broke. Job lined up in Denver fell through. I just need something to get back on my feet." Sarah's stomach twisted. "So this is about money." He didn't deny it. Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "You have no idea what she's been through. She almost died. Mark, she had pneumonia. I had to watch our daughter cough up blood because I couldn't afford a doctor." Mark looked away. "I'm not asking for a handout," he muttered. "I'm asking for a second chance." Sarah folded her arms tightly. "Then act like a father. Walk away. Don't scare her. Don't scream in her face and pretend it's love." David returned after sending Emma upstairs with one of the guards. He approached Sarah slowly. "Do you want me to call the police?" But she shook her head. "No," she said. "Let me handle this." David nodded, but didn't leave. She looked at Mark. "I'll make you an offer. One time." Mark's eyes lit up. $10,000. Cash. You sign legal papers terminating your rights. You leave Chicago, and you never contact us again. Ever. Mark hesitated. 15, he said. Then she said flatly, "You walk out now, or you walk out with nothing." David watched her. This woman, who had once been so afraid to ask for help, now standing like steel before her past. Mark thought for a long second, then nodded. Fine. 2 hours later, David's lawyer handed him a signed agreement. Mark boarded a Greyhound bus heading west, envelope in hand. David stood on the platform long after the bus pulled away, wind cutting through his coat. It didn't feel like justice. It felt like rot. Back at the building, Sarah was waiting for him in the lobby. "How much did you give him?" she asked without preamble. David's jaw tightened. "Then," she nodded slowly. "So that's the price of fatherhood now." "Sarah, I didn't ask you to do that. I was protecting Emma." Her arms folded across her chest. "Or were you protecting yourself?" He swallowed the sting of her words. He was a threat, and you solved it the only way you know how, by writing a check. Would you rather I let him stay, let him fight for custody, I would rather you ask me before making decisions that affect my daughter. David said nothing. Sarah stepped closer. I'm grateful for what you've done. I am, but don't mistake survival for consent. I didn't agree to be part of your redemption story. He flinched, just barely, but she saw it. Emma's upstairs, she said quietly. She's crying. Because her dad showed up and sold her for 10 grand. Tell her she's worth more, he whispered. Sarah's eyes filled, but her voice stayed steady. Then stopped trying to buy her. She turned and walked toward the elevator. Every step echoing like thunder on stone. David stood there, alone, and for the first time since Alice died, he wondered if kindness, when wrapped in wealth, could look too much like control. Chapter 6. Everyone has a price. David didn't sleep that night. He poured himself a drink in the silence of his penthouse, but it tasted like guilt. The city stretched below him, glowing with indifference. And somewhere, 15 floors down, a little girl cried into her mother's arms because her father had traded her for $10,000. He kept hearing Sarah's voice echo through the marble lobby. Don't mistake survival for consent. I didn't agree to be part of your redemption story. He hadn't meant to hurt her. He thought he was fixing things. But now, he wasn't sure anymore if what he offered was safety or control. By morning, Mitchell Technologies felt colder than usual. David walked the halls of his empire like a ghost. Everyone greeted him, but no one saw him. His assistant, James Thompson, was waiting in his office, tie crisp, eyes too sharp. James didn't waste time. We need to talk, he said. David sat down without speaking. James dropped a thick folder on the desk. It's about the Carter situation. David raised an eyebrow. What situation? James opened the folder, revealing charts, summaries, and pages of numbers, hospital bills, apartment costs, salary increase. You've personally signed off on over $145. So, in the past 3 weeks, that's just what I've tracked. David leaned back, and James folded his hands. Some board members are asking questions about your judgment. My judgment in helping a child who nearly died. Your judgment in getting emotionally entangled with an employee and her daughter. This isn't charity. David, it's a company. You're not just a man anymore. You're a brand. David stared at him, silent. James stepped closer, lowering his voice. Look, I'm your ally, always have been. But this thing with Sarah, it's not sustainable. You're getting too involved. David's hands clenched. She needed help. She needed boundaries. James replied, a long pause. Then, softly, David said, everyone has a price. Right. James gave a cautious smile. That's what business is built on. David looked away, out the floor to ceiling windows. Then maybe business is broken. That evening, Sarah stood in the building's small rooftop garden. The air was crisp, but not cruel. City lights flickered below. She had come here to think, but instead, she found herself staring up at the stars. When she heard footsteps, she didn't need to turn around. I didn't expect to see you tonight, she said. I needed air, David replied. She stayed silent. He stood beside her, not too close. I wanted to explain about Mark. I didn't do it to undermine you. I did it because I was scared. Of what? That he'd take her from you. From me. Sarah turned then, her eyes unreadable. You act like you don't need anyone, but the second someone lets you close, you take control of their life like it's a company. That's not protection, David. That's power. He winced. She looked down at her hands. You paid him off. You paid Emma's bills. You gave us a place to live, a job, a second chance. And yet, she met his eyes again. I don't know if you see me, or if you're just trying to erase what you lost. The air went still. David stepped closer, gently, like approaching a wounded animal. I see you. Sarah, do you? I see a woman who hasn't had a full night's sleep in 2 years, who works harder than anyone I know, who loves her daughter more fiercely than some people love life itself. He swallowed. I see someone who doesn't want to be saved. She just wants to stand on her own. Sarah blinked fast. But when I help, he continued, I don't do it to make you owe me. I do it because I care. She stepped back. Not far, just enough. That's the part that scares me, she whispered. Because if I start to care too, what happens when the balance shifts? When the debt feels like more than money? David didn't answer because he didn't know. Later that night, in her small apartment, Sarah tucked Emma into bed. Her daughter clutched a worn book in one hand, Matilda, the one David had given her. Do you like him? Emma asked suddenly, voice soft. Sarah brushed hair from her daughter's forehead. Who? David. Sarah paused. I think. I'm still trying to understand him. Emma nodded thoughtfully. He's sad, but not mean. He smells like books. Sarah laughed gently. Is that a good thing? Emma yawned. It's my favorite smell. As her eyes drifted shut, Sarah sat in the dark beside her, quiet, still, wondering if kindness could survive when it came wrapped in money, wondering if love was possible between two people built from such different worlds, wondering if this was a beginning or a beautiful mistake. Chapter 7. False Accusations. The knock came just after 6 a.m. Sharp, precise. The kind of knock that doesn't ask, it announces. Sarah rubbed sleep from her eyes as she pulled open the apartment door. 2 men and 1 woman stood there in dark suits. No smiles, no warmth. One held a badge, the other a file. Sarah Carter. She nodded slowly. We're with the Financial Crimes Division, Chicago PD. We'd like to ask you some questions regarding suspicious activity at Mitchell Technologies. Behind her, Emma shuffled out of her room in pajamas and bare feet, clutching her stuffed bear. Mommy! Sarah stepped in front of her, instinctively. What is this? We believe a series of unauthorized transactions were made using high-level internal codes. We have reason to believe you may have had access. I don't. What? Sarah shook her head. I clean the building. I run maintenance. I don't touch company finances. The woman agent's voice was firm. We'd still like you to come with us. Emma's lip trembled. Are they taking you away? No, Sarah said, crouching low. Voice calm, though her hands trembled. They just want to ask questions. Baby, I'll be back before you finish breakfast. She kissed her daughter's forehead, whispering a prayer she couldn't finish, then turned to face the officers. She didn't cry. Not yet. She didn't know that. Across the city, David Mitchell was already in handcuffs. Earlier that morning, James Thompson had walked into a precinct with a portfolio thick enough to spark an internal investigation. I'm here to report corporate fraud, he said. $2 million. Embezzled. I believe my CEO has been compromised by a woman he's grown personally attached to. He gave them everything. Timelines, transactions, emails, all pointing, conveniently, to David and Sarah. He's changed. James told the detective. Used to be sharp, ruthless. Ever since that girl and her mother showed up, he's been distracted, weak. By the time David arrived at work, federal agents were already waiting in his office. Mr. Mitchell, you're being detained for questioning regarding corporate theft and misappropriation of funds. David blinked slowly. You're joking. I'm afraid not. He saw the folder in their hands, his own financial records, digital signatures, transfers he'd never authorized, and then James, standing quietly in the corner, watching. They brought Sarah and David to separate rooms, questioned them for hours. Accusations layered like bricks, transactions she didn't recognize, codes she'd never used, questions she didn't understand. You were recently given an apartment, correct? Yes. And your daughter received private hospital care. She was dying. Paid for by David Mitchell. Yes. And you expect us to believe none of that came with strings. Sarah's fists clenched. He was kind. That's not a crime. But in their eyes, kindness was suspicious. They twisted everything: Emma's illness, the apartment, the sudden job, until Sarah's love looked like manipulation. And David, they said his grief had made him vulnerable, that Sarah had exploited his emotions, that he'd been too distracted to notice the theft happening under his nose. You gave her access, one agent said. You trusted her. That's negligence at best. She never touched a cent, David said quietly. She didn't have to, the agent replied. You gave her the keys. The worst part wasn't the accusation. It was that neither of them could defend the other because they weren't allowed to see each other. Sarah sat in a metal chair in a cold room, thinking of Emma, of the way she'd smiled at David's terrible jokes, of the warmth in her cheeks when he brought her books, of the safety in her voice when she'd say, "He's not scary. He listens." And now she didn't know where her daughter was. Across town, Emma sat on a bench at Child Services, wrapped in a borrowed coat, her bear tucked under her chin, her eyes scanning every adult who walked past, waiting for anyone to say they made a mistake. But no one did. She didn't cry, not until the sun started to fade. And even then, it was silent, just a tear running down a cheek no one noticed. By nightfall, Sarah was released with no charges, pending further investigation, they said. But stay in town. David was still held. The evidence pointed more strongly toward him. Access codes, account logins, the kind of digital fingerprints that felt impossible to refute. And James stood outside the building with a phone in his hand, already making more calls. His expression unreadable, calculating, cold. Inside, David stared at the wall of the interrogation room. He thought of Alice, then of Emma, then of Sarah's eyes the night she said, "Don't mistake survival for consent." And for the first time in his life, David Mitchell, CEO, Titan, man with everything, wondered if he was finally losing something that actually mattered, not because of guilt, but because he might never get the chance to prove he was innocent. Chapter 8. Emma's Escape. No one noticed the small figure slipping through the half-open door. No one ever does when they're focused on grown-up problems. Emma Carter had been sitting in the corner of the Child Services waiting room for over 5 hours. Her legs had fallen asleep. The coat she wore didn't smell like her mother, and no one had told her where David was. All she knew was that both of them had been taken away, and now she was alone again. She hadn't spoken much, not to the caseworker, not to the nurse who offered her juice. She just sat there, quietly clutching the stuffed bear David gave her during her second night in the hospital. It still smelled faintly of his cologne, and that's when she decided if no one was coming to help, she'd go help them. Emma slipped out of the waiting room, taking the stairs instead of the elevator, like her mother taught her. The security guard was on the phone, his back turned. The door clicked softly behind her. It was snowing again outside, and Chicago was too big for a 7-year-old girl. But she wasn't afraid. She had memorized the way to Mitchell Technologies, from the hospital, from the apartment, from every ride in David's car, when he'd point out the buildings and say things like, "See that one? That's where I made my first mistake. And that one. That's where I learned what mattered." She listened. Emma always listened. She knew if she could get back to the tall building with the green lights on top, someone there would help. Meanwhile, Detective Robert Nash stood in the precinct, staring at something that didn't sit right. A file from James Thompson. Too perfect, too prepared, too early. Then came the report from the diner Sarah had worked at. before it hadn't closed from missing funds, like James claimed. It closed because of the owner's gambling debts. Sarah had actually reported him, not stolen from him. And now, another file flagged by the Financial Crimes Unit. Offshore accounts, movements matching the embezzlement patterns, under a name tied to James Thompson. Robert's gut clenched. We've been chasing the wrong ghost. While officers scrambled to reopen the investigation, while David sat alone in a locked room, and while Sarah paced inside her apartment, whispering prayers, Emma Carter crossed 3 intersections and slipped through the side door of Mitchell Technologies. She knew the door. Her mom showed her the keypad once, just in case. She typed the code with shaking fingers. 2, 0, en 4. The year she was born. James was in David's office, fingers flying across the keyboard. A second screen showed wire transfers, offshore accounts, masked codes. He was smiling. Just one more click, one more clean exit. And then, Mr. James, he turned, startled. There she was. Emma, hair damp from snow, cheeks red, tiny shoes soaked through, holding a teddy bear like it was her last friend. What are you doing here? He said too quickly. I came to find David. She said softly. You took him. James straightened. Emma, sweetheart, you can't be here. It's not safe. He started toward her. She stepped back. Why are you using his computer? James blinked. What? That's David's computer. Why are you on it if he's not here? Her voice was quiet, but something in it made him freeze. She was watching him, closely, just like her mom. James swallowed. I'm helping David, trying to fix everything. Come here. Let me take you somewhere safe. But Emma didn't move. She reached for the small red button near the security desk, the one her mom told her to never touch unless something was really wrong. And she pressed it. Sirens blared. Red lights flashed. Detective Nash had just reached the lobby when the alert went out. By the time they reached the top floor, James was gone, but not far. They found him in the service stairwell, clutching a laptop, trying to disappear down a fire escape. Emma was safe, cold, but safe. When they asked her what happened, she pointed to the desk and said, he was scared when I caught him. David never looks scared. Only people who lie get that scared. That night, Robert Nash walked into the interrogation room where David sat in silence. You're free to go, he said simply. David stared at him, eyes heavy. What changed? Emma Carter, Robert replied, 7 years old, walked into the building alone, caught a corporate thief red-handed, and saved your legacy. David's breath caught in his chest. She's safe. She's better than safe, Robert said. She's why you're going home tonight. When David reached the hospital, where Emma had been taken for observation, Sarah was already there, arms around her daughter, face buried in her hair. She looked up when he entered, and everything stopped. David didn't speak. He just walked to the bed, knelt beside Emma, and whispered, You saved me, kiddo. Emma smiled sleepily. Told you I'm good at math. Outside, the snow began to fall again. But this time, it didn't feel cold. It felt like peace, like something broken, finding its way back to whole. Chapter 9. Redemption isn't a straight line. The next morning, sunlight fell gently across the hardwood floors of the hospital recovery room. Sarah sat by the window, a paper cup of cold coffee in her hands, watching Emma sleep peacefully under warm blankets. Machines beeped softly around them, no longer threatening just background noise now. The worst was over, but the ache in her chest, that hadn't left. David stood in the doorway, tie loose, eyes tired. He didn't walk in right away. Sarah looked up. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Two people with nothing left to hide, and everything still tangled between them. Finally, she nodded toward the chair beside her. You can come in. He sat down slowly, his hands clasped between his knees. She's okay, he asked. Sarah nodded. No frostbite, no injuries, just dehydrated and exhausted. But she's strong, David exhaled, looking down at his shoes. I should have protected her better. She shouldn't have needed to protect you, Sarah said, not unkindly. He didn't answer. For a long time, they just sat in silence, the kind that only exists between people who have both lost and nearly lost again. Finally, David spoke. James manipulated me. He played on my guilt, my grief. I trusted him with everything, and he turned me into a villain in your story. You turned yourself into that, Sarah replied, her voice quiet. When you stopped asking what we needed and started deciding for us. David looked at her then, really looked. You were right, he said. When you said I used money to fix things, it's what I've always done. I built walls with it, solved problems with it. I thought, if I threw enough at the past, I could rewrite it. And what did you learn? That redemption isn't a straight line. He said, it's messy, unearned, and it doesn't come with receipts. Sarah's lips twitched almost a smile. Almost not. She turned her eyes back to Emma. She still believes in you. You know, even after everything, you're still the man who gave her hot chocolate and read her books. David swallowed hard. I don't know if I deserve that. Probably not, she said, but neither did I. And yet, here we are. That afternoon, they left the hospital together. Not as a couple, not as a family, just together. The ride back to the apartment was quiet. Emma sat in the back seat, humming softly. The bear David had given her still clutched in her arms. She was drawing rainbows on the back of a clinic receipt, coloring them with a borrowed pen. Sarah looked out the window. David kept glancing at her, but said nothing until she did. If you want to keep being part of her life, Sarah said softly, you'll have to start over. No more decisions made for us. No more savior complex. He nodded. Agreed. You'll be patient. Yes. You'll listen? I'm listening now. Later that evening, David stood in front of a small bookshelf in his penthouse. A shelf that had once been cold glass and trophies. Now, it held only one thing, a small drawing of a rainbow, and the words, thank you. Mr. David, scribbled in purple ink. He smiled, not because the pain was gone, but because something else had taken root, something slow, earned. Downstairs, Sarah tucked Emma into bed. Is David still our friend? Emma asked sleepily. Sarah brushed hair from her forehead. He's trying to be, Emma yawned. I think he's lonely. Sarah paused, then nodded. Yeah, I think he is. Emma hugged her bear. Then we should share? Sarah smiled in the dark. You're a better person than most adults I know. At 11 p.m., there was a knock on Sarah's door. She opened it to find a brown paper bag and a handwritten note. Inside, 3 blueberry muffins. The note read, for Emma and for you. No strings, just thanks. Sarah stood in the doorway for a long time, watching the empty hallway. Then she closed the door. But not her heart, not anymore. Chapter 10. The Man Who Stayed. Spring arrived in Chicago like an apology. The snow melted slowly off the rooftops. Tulips bloomed stubbornly along cracked sidewalks. And for the first time in a long while, people walked a little slower, breathed a little deeper. And in apartment 15B of Mitchell Technologies' residential tower, the Carter girls were settling into something neither of them had dared believe in. Peace. Emma's cheeks had color again. Her cough was gone. Her sketchbooks were full drawings of butterflies, bookstores, and a man with graying hair reading to her beneath a tree. Sarah saw the drawings. She never said anything, but sometimes she would trace the lines with her finger and smile. David didn't force himself into their lives. He didn't buy them anything, didn't show up with keys or contracts or grand gestures. Instead, he waited, He knocked gently once a week, like clockwork, sometimes with a book, sometimes with muffins, sometimes with nothing but a question. Need anything fixed? If Sarah said no, he left. If she said yes, he stayed. Emma never needed an invitation. She would run to him like sunrise, bright and unfiltered. But Sarah needed time. And David gave it to her because he understood now. Love isn't earned in a moment. It's proven in what you choose to stay for. One evening, Sarah found him on the rooftop garden again, watering the potted rosemary she once mentioned liking. He didn't hear her approach. "I didn't peg you as a gardener," she said softly. He looked up, smiling. "I'm learning." She sat beside him on the bench. The city stretched out below them, messy, beautiful, alive. "I thought about running," she admitted. After the arrest, after the truth came out, it just felt like too much, too complicated. David nodded. "I wouldn't have blamed you." She looked at him. Then, long and searching. "But you didn't run." "No," he said. "I've done enough of that." A pause. "I used to think strength meant control, strategy, plans. But strength looks different now." "How so?" "It looks like showing up," he said, "even when you're not forgiven yet." Sarah's breath caught, not because it was a perfect answer, but because it was honest, because it was exactly what she needed to hear. Weeks passed. Emma's school sent home a project. "Draw your family." She drew herself, her mom, and David. Underneath, she wrote in bold purple crayon, "The man who stayed." Sarah saw it pinned to the fridge one morning and didn't take it down. On a rainy Saturday, Sarah invited David in for coffee. He stepped inside cautiously, still unsure of the ground beneath them. Emma looked up from her coloring and grinned. "Took you long enough." He laughed. "I was waiting for an invitation." "Well," Emma said, patting the empty seat next to her, "we don't wait anymore. We're brave now." Sarah handed him a mug. "She gets that from me." He smiled into the steam. "I know." They didn't talk about what would come next. Not that day. Because some moments don't need a title or a future forecast. They just need to be lived. That night, Sarah stood at the window while Emma slept, and David leaned against the doorframe, watching her in the low kitchen light. She turned, arms crossed, but face soft. "I never asked what changed you." David looked toward Emma's room. His voice was quiet. "A little girl in the snow looked up at me like I mattered. And for the first time since I lost my daughter, I wanted to be a man who deserved that look." Sarah didn't respond. She didn't need to. She just walked to him. And for the first time, not out of need, not out of rescue, but because it felt right, she reached for his hand. 3 months later, on a quiet morning in Lincoln Park, David Mitchell married Sarah Carter beneath a canopy of yellow tulips and spring wind. Emma was the flower girl. Her bouquet held butterflies and rainbows, drawn by her own hand. Margaret Mitchell, David's mother, stood beside them, tears in her eyes. Clarity returning more each day. There were no press releases, no champagne towers, just 3 people who found each other in the cold and chose to stay when it mattered most. The warmth that stayed. Sometimes, love doesn't come with grand declarations. It comes quietly, in the way someone shows up after you've been hurt, in the way they listen when others only fix, in the way they stay. David Mitchell never thought he'd find a second chance. Not after losing Alice. Not after building a life made of silence and glass. And Sarah Carter? She never believed anyone would see her again. Not as a burden. Not as a problem to be solved, but as a woman worth choosing. But a little girl in a pink coat rewrote their stories. Emma never asked for a hero. She just needed someone who wouldn't leave. And in saving her, they found the pieces of themselves they'd lost long ago. This wasn't a story about charity, or power, or rescue. It was a story about redemption that came slowly and stayed. About how trust isn't bought, it's built, and how love when real doesn't demand perfection, only presence. And that is what David became. Not the billionaire, not the CEO, but the man who stayed. Sometimes the right people arrive exactly when the heart is ready to hope again. If this story touched you even just a little, let it remind you that it's never too late to begin again. Share it with someone who believes in second chances. And if you're still waiting for your moment of warmth in the snow, maybe it's closer than you think. If this moved you, the next story goes even deeper. See you there. We'd love to hear from you. What did this story make you feel? Drop your thoughts in the comments and rate it between 0 and 10. Subscribe and turn on the bell so you're always updated. More inspiring stories are waiting. Click here to watch them.